On December the 5th, 1959, the expedition Pegasus Overland set out from England. The expedition consisted of 2 Land Rovers and 8 men. The leader was Stephen Fox, a trainee manager from the Wirral. Peter Finn, telephonic engineer of Liverpool. Lawrence Lalouette, window cleaner and engineer of Manchester. Ian Tompkins, engineer also of Manchester. John Nelson, a coal miner of Salford. Ronnie Fenton, a toolmaker and expedition comedian from Manchester. John Devine, a shipwright from Liverpool. And Barry Brewster, a doctor of Trinity College, Dublin. After 18 months of money saving and preparation, these 8 members of the 12th and 13th Battalion of the Parachute Regiment set out on their journey from Lydd Airport, flying across the Channel to Le Touquet.
On only our second day, we had to call a halt and severely reduce our load weight because the vehicles were proving unmanageable even on these good roads. Most of the jettisoned load we gave to André, the Belgian farmer on whose ground we were camping. We hurried on through Brussels and into Switzerland, for even now we were conscious of our race against the snows of high eastern Turkey. The St. Gothard Pass was blocked by snow, and we had to use the train ferry. In one village we witnessed an extraordinary car crash, in which the car cannoned from side to side of the road and finally fetched up against a wall, plunged through it and ran down a bank. We were able to help by winching the car back onto the road. Having shot through Italy in a day, we motored along the national youth-built autoputs of Yugoslavia. These are fast, well-surveyed roads. Bullock carts and night driving do not mix, and we usually manage to avoid both. Approaching the Iron Curtain of Bulgaria, the road deteriorated sharply, and more for novelty than necessity, we used four-wheel drive. Little did we guess then that four-wheel drive and chains would soon be of little avail. We made camp for our 5th night just on the western side of the Iron Curtain, and here met some odd people. Ian had quite a chat with this fellow to say he didn't speak a word of Slav. Already a routine was setting into our camp stops, each man having his own job to do. We even had our late riser, always Ronnie, the comedian, with Stephen Fox doing the ejecting. So we rolled up to the Bulgarian border, which was much like any other and as easily crossed. Our first red village, very similar to those we had passed through in Yugoslavia. The people were always fascinated by our vehicles. Sofia itself, however, was rather different and very policified, and I did not use the cine camera outside the vehicle. We were permitted only 24 hours to get through Bulgaria, but this suited our haste. In this Turkish village, transport arrangements tended to be somewhat primitive. And the dress of the women left a good deal to the imagination. The local market was a scene of great colour and clatter. Instance this rather sinister-looking salesman standing behind his Harry Lime-type ampoules. Istanbul and its minarets, said by Ronnie to be the Cape Canaveral of Turkey. The ferry across the Bosphorus and the beer of Istanbul are expensive items, so that we did not stay long. Pete Finn, as treasurer, always had the unpleasant jobs. Apprehension was mounting as we rushed at Ankara. We seemed so near now. In fact, the journey between Istanbul and Ankara held for us one twisted rear wheel bearing, a broken clutch, and a disastrously wrong road. To reach Tehran by Christmas Day seemed impossible, but we would try. Larry eventually led us unwilling into the mountains, and we made our first snow camp. The freezing metal tent poles stuck to our hands, and our sleeping bags were soon wet and cold. The temperature was really abominable. Cold, ice, snow, and wind, and invisible roads made the journey a treacherous one. It was at this stage that morale seemed in direct proportion to temperature. We discovered later that the inverse of this is true in the deserts. I remember I was reciting Gunga Din to Larry, and as I reached the words slimy and it stunk, the Land Rover slithered through the snow into some rocks. Shovel and crowbar working, we managed to turn the other vehicle round so that we could use the winch. Two hours later, we were clear, but with a severed hydraulic brake pipe. As brakes made little difference anyway, and temperature and time were such that progression was paramount, we moved on a few kilometers to our night camp. In fact, from dawn to dusk that day, we had made just 40 miles. We could hardly credit the change 2 days later. We were parched and hot, and one of our engines went on fire. I believe the army have a phrase concerning miles and miles of nothing to turn round in, and this was our first impression of Persia. We found Tabriz, however, and it was now Christmas Eve. This was our Christmas Day, having driven the Tabriz mountain range throughout the night of Christmas Eve. In a sandstorm, we discovered you do two things quickly: lose your way and get sick of sand. There are 900 miles of desert track hereabouts and 3 trees. Now there are 2. Because of the sand stream which the vehicles made, we were travelling at a 1-mile interval, and as this vehicle was in rear at the time, we had, as Larry put it, rather lost our paddle. However, this huge tanker gave us one sharp heave and almost pulled the vehicle in half. The crowbar did the rest. We had been told that we would not get through to Tehran in late December because of the snows in high eastern Turkey. That we had done so pleased us, but particularly so because we arrived into Tehran on Christmas Day, as planned. Ian found Ferdowsi Square, the hub of Tehran, and the sort of place I was permitted to film. There were others more interesting, but less decorative. At the embassy, we were generously given 3 essentials to complete our Christmas day: a bath, turkey, and beer. We established our camp in a luxurious but disused compound at a garage, the proprietor of which not only consented to our camping, but brought along vodka and caviar for Christmas. After some delays, we drove south towards Isfahan, leaving Tehran the day before 3 men were publicly hanged there. We were again in miles and miles of nothing. Some say that Isfahan is half the world. It is certainly wonderful, but Ronnie said he still preferred the other half. Whilst the others took tea with the Bishop of Isfahan, I had my leg set and put in plaster by Dr. Peter Wilde. The taxi had run over my foot as I was filming. Having driven the desert all day, we found a crystal clear stream, and the others all had a wonderful swim. I was not smiling. You can imagine that to fall asleep at the wheel is easily done in these conditions, and this is just what this unfortunate fellow had done. The huge tanker seemed to be in the most extraordinary bits, but the driver, miles from nowhere, seemed quite unperturbed and had simply gone to sleep again. We left him a bottle of beer and some water and moved on. So, back to driving on the left-hand side. At Quetta, we watched a military parade celebrating the Armed Forces Day. Everything about them, even the pipe tunes, were still very British. These worthy gentlemen were to take the salute. This is where we lived for 6 days downtown in Quetta. Letters home, sleep and reading occupied a fair portion of the day. This particular gentleman would sell you anything at all. I feel sure that grandmothers would be included in his list. Stephen Fox bargaining for some sheets with which to renew our safari beds. We left Quetta and motored to Lahore, where a man stopped us and asked us if we were lost. He turned out to be the Commissioner of Police in Lahore, and we later met his 14-year-old daughter, who entertained us playing the sitar. Having crossed the uncomfortable border of Pakistan and India, we landed in Delhi just in time for the Republic Day celebrations. Again, we found the military tone very British. The late President Nehru was in attendance. Each set of dancers represent a different state. From Delhi, inevitably to Agra and the Taj Mahal. Shah Jahan, for his love of the Mumtaz, built this great symbol. 22,000 men and 22 years it took to build the Taj. Once completed, the architect's hands were cut off, that he might never build another as beautiful. Outside, the locals, ever after the odd rupee, drew Stephen Fox's attention long enough to claim their reward. We had failed to get permission to enter Burma despite all our efforts, and so were compelled to take to the seas at Calcutta. We loaded the vehicles on the forward deck of the Camphorce and eventually sailed down the Hooghly River, leaving the melee of Calcutta behind us. The Hooghly River runs south from Calcutta to the ocean, and any of our group will tell you supports a vast population of the most vicious mosquitoes. This was a time to relax and write and consider our problems. The Camphorce was to take us around the Malaysian peninsula to Bangkok. We would then drive south to Singapore and sail later to northwestern Australia. Bangkok is situated on the river Chao Phraya, and the floating river population and the pointed roofs of the temples are the first signs of the city. The waterways are an important mode of transport about the city and provide a playground for children and disease. The Temple of Dawn is extraordinary and fantastic and beyond description. We spent a day at the Pasteur snake farm and watched fascinated whilst these two men climbed calmly into the pit, lifted the pots and deftly caught the snakes so that they might extract the venom from their glands. This would then be made into anti-snake bite serum by the process of active immunization. Once the venom had been extracted by the syringe, the snakes are thrown into the water around the pit, from which they seem disinclined to move. Beyond the immediate city area, with its many temples, can be seen the jungle through which we were now to travel. We had spent 10 interesting days in Bangkok, idling on beaches of silver sand and dining upon some of the most exotic dishes. We obtained from General Tulalumba of the Siamese police a letter which saved us a great deal of time at the various checkpoints on the jungle road as we travelled south towards Kuala Lumpur. Though not ungrateful, we were happy to be in our own camp again. The earth roads were good at this stage, and we found the jungle awe-inspiring and rather eerie, particularly at night. We set about our camp routine, but were somehow always conscious of something watching us. Larry, as always, was quite unperturbed. The roads began to deteriorate a little, but it is difficult to maintain a road when its bridges are annually swept away in the monsoons. Because the clearing next to this fellow's house was the only camping site for miles of jungle, we asked his permission to spend the night. He welcomed us and insisted that two of us sleep under his own roof. More than this, whilst his children plied us with tea, he rigged up this shadowgraph affair and put on this puppet show. The movement was accompanied by gongs and shrieking voice, which was added to by a clear starlit sky and the deep blue-black of the jungle. Now on the west coast of the peninsula, south of Ranong, we found a road working camp, which included a vehicle ramp and an electric generator, both of which we fully utilized. In the paradise of these western beaches, we had great fun in the massive surf. Some of the bridges were very grand affairs, and we saw considerable activity on road reconstruction. There were other bridges which were not so good and had to be bypassed. The road as a whole was becoming decidedly muddy. We crossed the terrorist no man's land at the Malayan border after curfew because we were in a hurry to get to Kuala Lumpur. At Kuala Lumpur, we did an attachment to 55 Company, the RASC Air Dispatch, during which we carried out a series of parachute supply drops to the anti-terrorist troops living in the jungle forts along the Sino-Malayan border. Valletta aircraft were being used. The dropping height was 250 feet, so that the planes had to fly up the valleys with the hills high on either side, drop the supplies, and climb rapidly out. Recording climb. A jungle fort. The dropping zone is a small rectangle looking like a pocket handkerchief. Of all the packs that we dropped, only 2 fell outside the dropping zone, and these by a few yards, which speaks volumes for the skill and judgment of the pilots. We next tried the other end of things and did 2 marches through the jungle. It seemed fun at first, but the novelty soon wore off. But we had to be moving on now, for we had a parachute drop arranged with the Far Eastern Survival School in Singapore. When it came to the parachute drop, the cine camera failed, and now follows a series of stills covering this event. The drop was made early one morning from a Beverley aircraft flying at 1,000 feet. Two days later, we embarked on the blue funnel ship, the Gorgon, and sailed for Derby in northwestern Australia, where we must find work, for our funds were now low. Between the 8 of us, we had just £16. This map shows our route round Australia after working in Derby. Our work was open-cast iron ore mining on the islands of Kulan and Cockatoo in the Yampi Sound. We worked here for 3 months and each managed to put £130 into the kitty. The launch and the Pioneer aircraft provide the transport to the islands. The iron ore there has such a high yield that it all goes for smelting, and the islands are in fact being slowly dug out of the sea. We left the northwest and motored the many hundreds of miles heading southwest for Perth, where I had been working in Fremantle Hospital. The outback is enormous and its solitude frightening. The journey from Derby to Perth took 6 hard driving days. Up till now, a swan had been white and feathered, but after 3 months in Western Australia, not any more. The Australian bush is good camping country, and we were thoroughly at home in it. The only drawback was the flies, big, fat, and perpetual. Ronnie hated them. One meets all sorts in the bush, from lizards to poodles. The owner of this animal performed his poodles for half the year and iron-ored for the other half. From Perth, we crossed the Nullarbor Plain to Adelaide, a journey of over 2,000 miles. We sailed from Adelaide for Aden on the Ixion, under the command of Captain Pilcher, and had a much-needed 10 days respite, in which Stephen and I wrote over 140 administrative letters. As we bathed and fooled about, We little dreamt of the troubles awaiting us in Aden when we would attempt to cross the Gulf to Africa. It seemed so small a reach of sea to us in the middle of the Indian Ocean, and the Deck Quoits Championship seemed to be the most important issue of the day. We were a day late arriving in Aden, and because of this missed a ship called the Lam Sun, which later sank in the monsoon seas with only 4 survivors. We made several wretched attempts to cross the Gulf of Aden. We are here loading onto a ship of 150 tons, using gear that was barely fit to lift a few sacks of rice. Eventually, we had to abandon the idea of a sea route and gratefully, though regretfully, flew to Nairobi with the Royal Air Force. Eastleigh Airport, Nairobi, and our arrival in Beverley Aircraft. We were to establish a base camp near Nairobi and from here work toward 3 objectives. The first, the game reserve of Amboseli and the Ngorongoro crater. The second, the national park in Uganda. And finally, the mountain Kilimanjaro. The King's Regiment generously provided our base camp and was a most helpful host. We journeyed south into Tanganyika and spent 10 days in the national park near Lake Manyara. If Ronnie, ever the poor man's white hunter, had had his way, he would have filled a 10-ton truck with his souvenirs. We were loath to leave this fascinating place, but we now journeyed northwest into Uganda and on to Para village on the Victoria Nile. Our plans had to be changed perforce because of the political events in the Congo, and it was decided that we would have to return to Nairobi after our stay at Para instead of running the gauntlet towards Paulis in the Congo and so to Nigeria. This odd fellow was our welcome at Para village. But it takes all sorts to make a world. From the village of Para, we made a launch trip up towards the base of the Murchison Falls in order to see the game on the river banks. Hippos have a nasty habit of surfacing under your boat. Our pilot kept well clear. the base of the Murchison Falls. It was in order to travel around to the top of these falls that, next day, we took this rather quaint ferry. The ferry took us across the Victoria Nile at a point about 4 miles below the falls. Such simple events as driving off a ferry always held a certain amount of drama, which it may be difficult to understand. It wasn't merely that some mishap might occur to one of the vehicles, but that it might occur at that moment in that place, miles from anywhere. The Murchison Falls are a wonderful and frightening picture of water force. The whole vast Victoria Nile is suddenly asked to wrench itself through a rock gap of some 30 feet, and this is its roar of protest. It was bewildering. We now drove southeast towards the equator, which we were to cross for the 5th time of our journey. We were now headed for our 3rd and final objective, which stands on the border of Kenya and Tanganyika and towers to a height of almost 20,000 feet, the mountain Kilimanjaro. About a mile from Loitokitok, outward bound school, we set up our base camp, from which we could see our objective, Kilimanjaro, with its ice cap. The organization of equipment for the 4 or 5 day climb was obviously important. Weight and water were our chief worries. Some of the local Maasai watched fascinated as Larry packed his haversack. Thin, tall people who always carry spears, these herdsmen were fighting with a rival tribe 2 days after these shots were taken. But we had little time to lose, and we left early the next morning. Because of weight, I was advised by the outward bound school to leave the cine camera behind during the climb. These stills show us at the upper limit of the tree line. Setting out from Second Caves, where we had slept the night. On the steep scree ascent during the assault. Gilman's Point at the summit. And a view of the ice cap. 4 days later, very tired and considerably weathered, our cheeks and lips scaled and cracking. 5 of us reached the summit. The others, suffering from altitude sickness, were compelled to descend. This old woman seemed to have less trouble with her great load than we had merely with our haversacks. Ronnie had a brief description for his condition. Ian longed for beer we didn't have. I felt like Ronnie, and Ronnie reaffirmed his feelings. We found this fellow at Camp 2, suffering from altitude sickness. With the climb behind us, we left Loitokitok to hasten through the NFD, Northern Frontier District of Kenya, and into Ethiopia. This is our route northwards to Khartoum through Ethiopia, where we met the worst travelling of our journey. It is difficult to describe how brittle one becomes after a long day of this sort of thing, particularly when, during it, you become thoroughly lost and at the end of it are not really very far on. You sit by the campfire and try not to think of all the petrol which has been wasted, and of how many long miles it is to the next unlikely supply. Hoping desperately that this will not be dry, you sleep and dream of full 4-gallon cans. At this oasis of Wuchili Wells, we saw many herds of cattle, goats and other animals, each herd patiently waiting its turn to descend the culvert to these extraordinary man-powered wells. Watered cattle emerge from the culvert, and Peter and Ian descend its spiral course down towards the well proper, passing some goats patiently waiting their turn at the trough. In the well shaft, the men stand crazily on stakes driven into the vertical wall of the cavern, which forms the well. Standing vertically thus, shoulder on shoulder, and chanting away, they form a rhythmic human chain of buckets, the water eventually emerging into daylight and so into the cattle trough. On terrain such as this, something is obviously bound to give sometime. There are good days and bad days. And this was one of the bad days, when one's vocabulary becomes expressively monosyllabic. The springs which we now had fitted to the rear axle were heavier than normal. This was the beginning of the end of our 5th spring. We were now headed for Addis Ababa, where there would be pumps with petrol in them, taps from which water flowed, and we might even find a bath and some beer. Having first established our base camp, we then went to the British Embassy to collect our mail. There we heard about a Coptic church celebration, and that night I was able to film this extraordinary event. His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie Lion of Judah, was soon to arrive. After much ceremony, the emperor moved forward to light the fire, round which his loyal chanting and screaming subjects would dance. The road to the north of Addis left us in no doubt about one thing. The Italians build the best roads in the world. The roads are straight as a die across the plains, only to wind and curl across the mountains like the track of some giant snail. The landscape changes rapidly. Maize fields to barren mountainside and back again. It is hot by day and cold by night because of the altitude. Lunch was our light meal of the day, enabling us to utilize maximum daylight. On this occasion, we were joined by these extremely hungry fellows, locusts. The radiator grills of the vehicles were daily packed with their green and yellow corpses. The locust is the scourge of this region, though much is being done to control them. Spraying the larval form from an aeroplane is far the most effective means of control. The pilot's map reading has to be excellent. There is no room for error. This government plane and American crew were provided with an armed guard, so we gratefully set up camp with them, for bandits are not unknown hereabouts. We were now to leave the mountains of Ethiopia and passed westward towards the deserts of eastern Sudan. We ran a half shaft and were compelled to stay here for 4 days. Having abundant water, Dobie was obviously a must. Stephen Fox and John Devine set to. By a quite extraordinary chance, we managed to acquire the correct-sided half shaft from a government vehicle which had crashed the day before our arrival. Having failed to knock through the broken end, we finally stripped the differential. Soon we were rolling again towards and across the Kassala desert of sand and rock, and so towards Khartoum. Our route from here lay northwards across the Nubian desert and thence by the Nile to Cairo, and our journey through Abyssinia was over. Wadi Halfa, where we were refused permission to proceed into Upper Egypt by land. We had to use the River Nile. We were stuck at Wadi Halfa for 6 days. John Devine was obviously many miles away at this stage of the game. Larry and Ian repaired the steering box, which had been severely punished by the patches of drift sand which suddenly gripped the wheels like a giant vice and slow trucks from 40 to a grinding halt within a few yards. So, river transport was added to land, sea and air, and it was onto this scrap iron barge, the Zeus, that we gingerly loaded the vehicles. The barge looked very top-heavy. Thus we sailed down the Nile and approached the wonder of Abu Simbel. These temples are hollowed within the mountain itself, and the magnificence of the pharaohs is cut into the rock face. Feeling very insignificant on our scrap iron barge, under the shadow and enormity of these temples, we continued down the river towards Shilal and Luxor. The business of unloading at Shilal was nightmare work. Having built a gangway of 2 beams and cross planks, we manhandled the vehicles into position and then waited for the crack of splintering wood and the tearing noise of metal. However, there were no casualties, except for the customs official who ordered us to reload the vehicles and received, I'm afraid, a rather short reply. The desert journey from Khartoum had been exhausting, and we looked forward to a rest in Cairo. At Luxor, even the temples of Amon, king of the gods, raised but little interest, for our minds were by now oversaturated. Here we met the usual gentlemen who tried to sell us postcards, camels, and finally the temples of Luxor themselves. Larry arranged to meet him the next day, and we promptly fled north to Cairo. After the Suez affair, the embassy had been demoted to a mission, and we were permitted to utilize the gardens. These included a swimming pool, and we could hardly believe such luxury. Still within the embassy compound, we were permitted to camp in this yard, for which we were most grateful, for camping in or near Cairo would be quite impossible. These cars stand token to the Suez affair. We now turned westward and drove into the desert via the pyramids at Sahara City. The pyramids we found impressively large. The Sphinx surprisingly small. Even the inscrutable smile seemed to have worn off. We paid our money for the usual camel ride that each might for a moment become a poor man's Lawrence of Arabia. We took the desert road towards the Egyptian-Libyan border, and the macadam felt peculiarly smooth and easy. Our speed seemed terrific. It was here, in the unending desert of North Africa, that we had reason to reflect upon the war so recently past. For a young soldier of today, it was moment enough to pause and consider the sad futility of war. These wreaths are laid on each anniversary by German and Italian authorities. Into Libya and westward along the North African coast. The sea was most inviting, particularly when our bathing place was in the shadows cast by the huge pillars of the city of Leptis Magna. Leptis Magna was one of the most flourishing of the Phoenician cities, and now its ruins are amongst the most imposing Roman remains in North Africa. We got stuck in the sand on several occasions, but this lot seemed particularly soft, for the time was past noon and the sun had done its work. It became necessary to completely offload the vehicle and lay tracks. Our average speed had doubled on this tar macadam strip, which traces over the flat, tedious desert. In Tunisia, we camped near this quaint French-flavoured town of Gabes, although there are parts of it which don't smell as quaint as they look. Ian had a wander through the market and met this fellow, whose salesmanship rivaled with that of our friend who tried to sell us the temples in Luxor. But there were things to do back at camp, fitting spare tubes, and for Larry and Ian playing with other people's boats. We left Gabes for Sfax, which was, relatively speaking, quite the big city. So to Tunis and the last sea crossing to Palermo, which at this stage seemed virtually home. It seemed so many miles and months ago now, to the bitter mountains of high eastern Turkey, to the fascination of the game reserves of Amboseli and the Goragora crater, to the tortured waters of the Murchison Falls and the unending sands of the Nubian desert. We had by any count come a long way, and each of us, in our own way, had gleaned a fair deal. We had travelled across 3 continents and crossed through 34 countries in 1 week less than a year.